This week, the US Federal Reserve has a critical decision to make on interest rates. In Australia, the Reserve Bank, well, it has just a little over a fortnight to see how things wash out. Now, the big question is whether rates need to keep rising to crush inflation or whether more rate rises will simply exaggerate the banking crisis. Adam Creighton, Washington correspondent for the Australian newspaper and a contributor here on Sky News, joins me now. Adam, always great to chat to you. That is a dilemma for central banks, isn't it? Because if they don't crush the inflation now, it hangs about and becomes the problem that they all talk about.
Yes, look, it certainly is a problem for them. I mean, my sense is that they're going to press on and keep lifting rates. I mean, the week before these banking crises emerged in the US, the chairman of the Fed here was very emphatic in his testimony that he was actually looking to 50 basis point rises in coming months. And I think the market expectation is still for 5.5% terminal rate by the end of this year in the US, which is a lot more than the 4.75 that it's at now. And you'd have to think, based on that, given the influence the Fed has over central banks all around the world, that the RBA is going to have to keep lifting too. And indeed, inflation's even higher in Australia, as you know. I think 7.5%. It's fallen to about 6% here, but still, that's at least triple what the inflation target is. I mean, inflation's been above 5 in the US now for 20 months, so certainly not transitory. And if central banks are going to maintain their credibility, they have to get that inflation down. And so far, you'd have to say there's very little sign of these fairly substantial interest rate increases having worked.
So the other aspect of this is this is almost a narrow path that they talk about. On one hand, you don't get rid of the inflation, and so long term you get higher unemployment, lack of investment, all of the bad things that come, higher interest rates for longer. If you do go too hard, you tip the economy and perhaps many of your banks off the edge of the cliff. And that really is the fear of a contagion around the world is the reason why Credit Suisse, all these various banks got caught up in this week.
Yes. Yes, look, it is. I mean, it's very embarrassing, I think, for the US if we just stick there. I mean, you know, they've been telling us about their great regulations, their improved regulations since the GFC, their tougher supervision, and then you have these, you know, reasonably sized banks. I mean, I think SVB is about half the size of ANZ or something like that. Essentially collapse, and this just completely snuck up on everyone. I mean, it was the depositors that seemed to notice the problems before the supervisors by the stampede to withdraw their money. And so you have to ask what the Fed supervisors were doing there, because they have dedicated staff looking at each bank. I mean, dozens of them. So I don't know what was going there. I think there's some questions to answer. But the bank, you know, then there's the question of the bailout. And I think this is, I mean, from an economic point of view, the biggest concern here, the US government seems to have guaranteed all deposits in the US financial system. They've set an extraordinary precedent. I mean, that $250,000 limit, the same in Australia, by the way, has been in place for a very long time. And then in just the stroke of a pen, it's meaningless. I mean, it's basically arbitrary. So if the Fed decides they like you, they'll let you out.
And think about that also. Think about guaranteeing every deposit in every bank in the United States of America. I mean, the obligation or the potential obligation on taxpayers is absolutely astonishing for that.
Yes. Yes, look, that's why. I mean, I think this notion here that Biden's been saying, and actually Janet Yellen just this week in her testimony, that, you know, this wasn't a bailout and that taxes weren't being used. But of course, the levies on banks to fund the insurance are, of course, taxes. You know, you have to pay them. They're just another tax. So that's false. The question here is how believable is that they're all insured now? Or is it, in maybe even worse situation, it's just arbitrary? So you need to curry favour with the Democrat Party maybe, or the Republican Party, if they're in power, provide lots of donations. I mean, we've seen that these people who lost their deposits, not lost their deposits, were extremely wealthy investors in California. You know, certainly people that were sophisticated enough to know what they were doing. And some of them were Chinese, I just heard today as well, are wealthy Chinese investors. And yet they've been made whole by customers of banks in, say, East Palestine, you know, kind of very poor communities in the US. So I think the politics of this still has some way to play out, but the economics are certainly very bad from my point of view.
Okay, so then you go to something like a First Republic and you see it is the banking industry that comes together to basically put the rescue package together for that bank. That maybe gives you a sense because the banks historically, when things went bad, except in the case of, say, for example, Lehman Brothers, they were the ones who generally rallied around to save competitors.
Yeah, look, and I think that's a good outcome. I think when the private sector it kind of works it out itself. I mean, of course, there's been some encouragement from regulators here in that particular case, but that's a better situation, I think, than the Fed or the regulators actually making depositors whole, as they did with SVB. We just have to hope that these problems are not more widespread. I mean, of course, we have had these rapid interest rate increases. That's meant that the market value of bonds have fallen very dramatically, and a lot of these banks have these bonds. And so there's a lot of unrealised losses. And we don't know how widespread they are. So it still remains to be seen. But my sense is that this is not going to be another financial crisis. And I think you'll see stocks rebound in the next weeks. But, famous last words.
Famous last words. You never say never. I tell you what, it's always great to chat to you. Thank you so much, Adam. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks, Ross.